How could a date that had never existed bring the Harbor Pine Inn to the edge of ruin? At 9:05 a.m., I stood beneath the empty keyboard with the state-certified letter trembling between my fingers. Sylvia and Brent stared at the impossible date boxed in red, while Miles watched the brass master key sealed inside my evidence bag. Then Grant's voice came through the speaker. The suspended license transfer meant there could be no Friday closing. Sylvia's knuckles whitened against the reception desk. How could one date erase a $3,200,000 sale? Grant paused, and Miles covered his vibrating phone as sweat gathered at his hairline. Roughly 6 weeks earlier, it had all begun with that same brass master key. At 7:15 on Tuesday morning, January 27th, I reached for the Harbor Pine Inn's brass master key and touched an empty hook. The little white label beneath it still read Master in my handwriting. Every other key hung in order, their blue tags facing outward, but that hook showed a pale scratch where brass had rubbed the paint for years. Outside, wind pushed snow dust across Bayview Street. Inside, the lobby smelled of pine cleaner, old radiators, and the coffee I had started before checking arrivals. As general manager, I noticed wrong details before right ones. This one tightened my throat. I'll tell you where that missing key led and what it cost me to find out. Subscribe now, then stay with me, because the first lie sounded almost too harmless to remember. "Miles?" I called. My husband was in my office behind the front desk, leaning over the printer with his leather satchel open on a chair. He had stopped by before his first speech therapy appointment because the printer at our rental cottage had jammed again. Miles was 37, gentle with frightened children, nervous dogs, and any conversation that might become an argument. He filled silence the way some people filled a sugar bowl, one careful spoonful at a time. "Morning," he said. "Your printer makes that grinding noise because the paper guides are uneven. I can fix it, probably. Not fix it professionally, obviously, but improve it. The master key is gone." I stepped into the office and checked the desk drawer, although I never kept it there. The drawer held deposit envelopes, 2 flashlights, spare batteries, and a roll of peppermints aligned against the side. Miles glanced toward the key cabinet, then lowered his eyes to the page in his hand. "Maybe you moved it during the weekend rush," he said softly. "You worked late Sunday. People do automatic things when they're exhausted." I told him I had locked it onto its hook at closing. The certainty in my own voice surprised me. I could picture the key swinging once, then settling against the board. I searched the practical places first, beneath the reservation binder, beside the safe, in the lost property drawer, and under the blotter where receipts like to creep. My palms began to sweat despite the cold office. That key opened guest rooms, linen closets, the liquor store room, and the door behind reception. Losing it was not an inconvenience. It was a security report, replacement cylinders, and explanations to every winter guest. Miles followed me into the narrow space and offered possibilities in a low stream. A housekeeper might have needed it. A guest might have reached over the desk. The hook could have failed. Each explanation was soft enough to sound considerate and vague enough to leave no mark. "Nothing else is disturbed," I said. The cash drawer seal was intact. The overnight envelope sat exactly under the stapler. Even the cabinet door had been closed. Miles crouched near the bottom shelf, as if checking beneath it. His shoulder blocked my view, and I heard a small metallic tap, followed by the rasp of his satchel zipper. When he stood, his cheeks were pink from the overheated room. I looked at the bag, but he shifted it behind his leg and smiled with the patient expression he used when asking someone to try a difficult sound again. I registered the movement without attaching meaning to it. That failure would matter. Miles lifted the satchel from the chair and set it beside my filing cabinet, trapping its strap under his shoe. "Maintenance probably borrowed the key," he said. We had no maintenance worker scheduled that morning, only an on-call contractor who signed out every key. Before I could point that out, Miles picked up the crooked printout and said, "Did you see the forecast? Another storm Friday. We should get groceries tonight and maybe soup from that place you like." His hand remained on the satchel. The subject changed so smoothly that, for 1 weak second, I let it. 3 days later, I had spent the interval running the inn, checking access logs, and getting nowhere about the missing key when the 4:30 meeting on Friday's calendar pulled me from my office into the conference room. Miles carried his satchel as far as the doorway, then lingered beside me. Sylvia Keene, my 62-year-old mother and a 35% co-owner of Harbor Pine Inn, had entered the meeting herself under ownership review. She sat at the head of the table with a gray folder squared to its edge. She had never forgiven her father for leaving me the largest share, and she handled that resentment like an unpaid balance. Brent Keene, my 39-year-old brother, had come because Sylvia summoned him as the third shareholder. He dropped into a chair wearing the navy quarter zip he used for vendor meetings at the restaurant where he worked as purchasing manager. Brent laughed before insults, as if amusement made cruelty less deliberate. He glanced at the snow beyond the windows and said, "Nice crowd, Daff. I counted 3 cars." January was always thin in Camden, and he knew it. "Empty rooms don't earn a cent," Sylvia said. She opened the folder and slid a letter across the polished table. The offer printed near the top was $3,200,000. My pulse jumped, then steadied around details. The buyer wanted the building, land, furnishings, brand rights, and future bookings. Closing depended on clear title and unanimous owner consent. I owned 40%. Sylvia and Brent together controlled 60%, enough to outvote me on ordinary business, but not enough to sell the inn. Sylvia would receive $1,120,000. Brent stood to receive $800,000. My projected share was $1,280,000. The figures were clean. The speed was not. "When did they inspect?" I asked. "Who gave them occupancy records?" Sylvia tapped the offer. "Those are side questions. Sign by Monday." "I'm not signing." The words dried my mouth, but they came out level. Brent laughed and leaned back. "Of course not. Grandpa gave you 40% and suddenly you think you're the lighthouse keeper?" His knee bounced beneath the table. I knew restaurant purchasing paid well, but not well enough to explain the new watch on his wrist or the panic beneath his grin. I did not yet know he had borrowed against money he expected from the sale. Miles touched my shoulder and began one of his soft explanations. Perhaps everyone needed time. Perhaps the offer could be reviewed without anyone feeling cornered. Perhaps a cafe-sized investment from the proceeds could create options for us. He stopped when I looked at him. "You knew?" I asked. Miles's fingers slipped from my coat. He said Sylvia had mentioned interest, not a formal offer, and that avoiding a fight had seemed kinder until there was something definite. Sylvia watched him without surprise. That was the physical inconsistency. My mother never tolerated uncertainty, yet she let him ramble. "There are 22 employees whose winter schedules depend on this place," I said. "There are deposits, weddings, and summer reservations. I want the buyer's full plan." Sylvia closed the folder. Brent shoved his chair back, announced that I was blocking all of them, and walked through the lobby into the parking lot, where his tires spat gray slush. Miles followed me back toward my office, his satchel bumping his hip. "I didn't agree to anything," he said. "I only listened. Sylvia thinks there could be room for $75,000 so I could revisit the cafe, but that isn't why I'm asking you to consider it." My stomach clenched. The abandoned cafe lease had already cost us savings he claimed were intact. I told him my answer remained no. He nodded too quickly, carried the bag through the swinging door, and disappeared into the inn kitchen, where pans clattered as he offered to help with dinner service. I returned to the conference room. Sylvia was still seated, waiting, without her folder open. When the door shut behind me, I asked, "Is that all this place is to you? Your payout?" Her gaze moved over my face as though checking a column. "Your 40% is worth $1,280,000, she said quietly. "Your feelings are worth 0. Then she turned the unsigned signature page toward me and placed her pen across the line bearing my name. About a week and a half later, I had filled my days at Harbor Pine Inn with payroll, winter bookings, and unanswered demands for sale documents, when, at 11:20 on Monday morning, February 9th, I found a notice taped inside the staff break room door. It carried the prospective buyer's logo and a heading about post-closing operational alignment. The paper was fresh, but one corner had absorbed steam from the dishwasher and curled inward. I read it twice. 22 existing positions would be eliminated after acquisition. Employees could apply for a smaller number of replacement jobs with no promise that pay, seniority, or hours would carry over. My fingertips went cold. 22 was not an accounting phrase. It was every person whose schedule I had approved that week: front desk, housekeeping, breakfast service, laundry, and night coverage. Sylvia had presented the sale as a transfer, not a clearance. I pulled the notice down and carried it to my office, where the radiator clicked beneath the window. At the bottom was a Boston number for Grant Webb, Acquisitions Director. I shut the door, placed the page beside the offer, and called. A receptionist transferred me. The man who answered identified himself as Grant Webb and asked for my role before discussing the file. His voice was precise, brisk, and entirely awake. If you recognized your own family in the person who calls betrayal just business, write one word in the comments. Who? Names are optional. The relationship is enough. I'm Daphne Voss, General Manager and 40% owner, I said. Silence held for half a second. Then a chair rolled over carpet at the other end. Grant told me he was in his Boston office with the acquisition file open. Section 4.2 limits disclosure before closing, he said, but Section 7.1 permits operational notices after unanimous consent. That consent was delivered to us. I looked at the unsigned page Sylvia had left on the conference table. You don't have unanimous consent, I said. I refuse the offer. Grant did not soften his answer. Ms. Keene supplied written approvals from owners holding 100%. The room seemed to tilt without moving. I pressed my free hand against the desk until the wood edge hurt. Grant asked whether I was withdrawing consent after signing. I told him I had never given it. He began quoting another section, then stopped when he heard my breathing. To be clear, he said, are you disputing the authenticity of your signature? Outside my office, a housekeeping cart squeaked down the corridor. Someone laughed near the lobby fireplace. Those ordinary sounds made the moment worse. I said yes. The word was barely louder than the radiator, but Grant repeated it back and began making notes. He explained that Sylvia had represented the approval as unanimous and complete. The buyer had relied on it while preparing transition materials, including the staff notice I was holding. I asked whether Sylvia had disclosed the 22 eliminated jobs to the owners. Grant said employee restructuring appeared in the transaction summary provided with the consent packet. No such summary had reached me. Sweat gathered beneath my collar despite the February light. Freeze the transaction, I said. Grant replied that Section 9.3 required an internal fraud review before further reliance on disputed documents. For the first time, his contract language sounded less like pressure and more like distance from an explosion. Send me what you received, I said. Grant confirmed my email address from the supposed consent form, which meant whoever completed it knew my private account. From his Boston office, he scanned the disputed page while I remained behind my locked office door in Camden. The phone stayed against my ear. Neither of us filled the silence. Then my laptop chimed. Grant said, I've sent the signature page. Please do not alter the attachment. I opened his email and saw my typed name, my ownership percentage, and a slanting signature shaped like mine, but made by someone who lifted the pen where I never did. For roughly a week and a half, I kept working at the inn while saving emails, reviewing access logs, and bringing every copied file home to our rental cottage. At 9:40 on Friday evening, February 20th, I sat at the kitchen table with the disputed signature enlarged on my laptop. Miles stood at the sink, explaining, softly and unnecessarily, why he had forgotten to buy milk. His satchel rested beneath his winter coat by the door. The coat sagged on one side, though its pockets looked empty. I noticed because Miles always complained when weight pulled wool out of shape. Grant had asked me to preserve anything connected to the inn's security system, so I had downloaded the cloud backup before Sylvia could change the administrator password. I opened footage from the night the brass master key disappeared. The hallway camera showed Miles entering through the staff door after midnight, his face washed gray by infrared light. Sylvia followed him. He held the door for her, then removed something from his coat and unlocked my office. My throat tightened. "Come here," I said. Miles kept rinsing the same clean glass. "Daphne, I'm tired. Can this wait?" I turned the laptop toward him. "No." He stared at the screen without asking what it showed. That was the first answer. I replayed the clip, watching Sylvia slip into my office while Miles looked down the corridor. "You told me you were asleep beside me," I said. He dried his hands and began filling the silence. He had only wanted everyone to calm down. Sylvia needed records. The sale would solve problems none of us wanted to discuss. Each explanation arrived padded in the gentle voice he used with frightened patience. "How did you leave without waking me?" I asked. His eyes moved toward the mug rack, not the door. I remembered the bitter edge in the chamomile tea he had brought me that night and how heavily I had slept. My fingertips went cold against the laptop. "What did you put in it?" I asked. Miles whispered that it had been one of his prescription sleep tablets, crushed, and that he had believed the dose was harmless. The room sharpened around me, salt stains on his boots, a water ring on the table, the refrigerator clicking off. He had drugged me in my own kitchen, waited until my breathing changed, and let my mother enter the inn while I slept. "What did you give her besides access?" I asked. Miles sat opposite me, but did not touch the chair back, as though fingerprints had suddenly become dangerous. He admitted sending Sylvia a scan from our abandoned cafe lease file because it contained several examples of my signature. The lease had left him with debts he had hidden from me. Sylvia had promised him $75,000 after closing, enough to settle them and try another cafe. "I thought once the money came I could explain," he said. I felt a pulse beating high in my throat. "You plan to explain after selling my consent." His phone lay beside his elbow. When I asked for it, he covered it with his palm. I reached instead for his satchel, pulled it from beneath the coat, and heard metal strike the buckle. Miles rose too quickly. I opened the inner pocket and lifted out the key. A strand of blue lint clung to its teeth. "Give me that," he said, no softness left in his voice. I stepped back, holding it where we could both see it. "You took this from my office." He said Sylvia had instructed him to keep it until the buyer's review ended. I photographed the key, then placed it in a clear evidence bag and sealed the strip while Miles watched. Using my laptop, I copied his message thread with Sylvia, including the signature scan, the drug reference, and her promise of payment. His shoulders lowered when the files finished transferring. He understood before I spoke. "Pack enough for tonight and get out," I said. Miles carried his coat and satchel through the front door, then turned on the porch as freezing air swept into the cottage. "Daphne, please let me explain what happens if Sylvia finds out." I locked the door, kept the evidence bag in my hand, and wondered why that sounded less like fear for himself than a warning for me. For roughly 2 weeks, I worked from the inn's cramped bookkeeping room, met remotely with counsel, and kept the sealed evidence at the cottage while Sylvia and Brent pushed ahead as if disputed signatures were a scheduling inconvenience. At 6:10 on Sunday evening, March 8th, Sylvia summoned me to the Harbor Pine Inn's conference room. Brent was still outside in the parking lot when I arrived. Through the window, I saw him end a call and grin at his reflection in a dark SUV. Sylvia had placed a removal resolution beside my untouched water glass. Together, her 35% and Brent's 25% gave them the votes to replace me as manager. "The sale requires unanimity," I said, reading the page twice. "Removing the manager does not," Sylvia replied. She tapped the salary line with one square fingernail. To her, my years at the inn could be reduced to payroll. Brent entered smelling of cold air and restaurant fryer oil. He laughed before saying, "Look at it this way, Daph. Now you can stop pretending the place would collapse without you." Sylvia instructed me to surrender passwords, vendor records, and management access immediately. I gave her the operational handover I had prepared, but not my personal evidence or disputed files. Miles appeared in the doorway carrying a banker's box. Sylvia had told him when the meeting would begin. I knew because I had seen her message in the thread I copied. He avoided my eyes and set the box beside her chair. Inside were books, framed photographs, and the blue ceramic mug from my former manager's apartment upstairs. "Why are you here?" I asked. Miles rubbed his thumb along the cardboard seam. He said he wanted the transition to remain calm, then added that Sylvia had offered him somewhere to stay. The careful explanation landed plainly. He had chosen her. Brent slid a glossy printout across the table. My former apartment had already been photographed and listed as the Harbor Suite, complete with harbor view language and a nightly rate. The bedspread was new, but the wall beside the radiator still carried the pale rectangle where my grandfather's map had hung. "Empty rooms don't earn a cent," Sylvia said. Brent laughed again and told her the suite could take bookings as soon as housekeeping finished. I folded the removal resolution once, put it in my bag, and refused to let my hands shake until I reached the lobby. If someone sold your trust and then asked you to leave quietly, write one figure in the comments, the amount you would demand or the number of days you would give them. What happened next began on Monday, and it changed what everyone in that lounge believed they had secured. I walked through the lobby while the fire snapped behind its brass screen. No one stopped me. Outside, wet snow reflected the inn's amber windows, and my palms slipped against the steering wheel. I drove away slowly enough for Sylvia to watch my taillights disappear toward downtown Camden. 2 blocks later, I turned through the waterfront parking lot, waited behind a delivery van, then circled back on a side street. I left my car where the building hit it and crossed the crusted snow toward the service wing, keeping below the kitchen windows. The service window beside the lounge had never sealed properly. In winter, staff stuffed folded towels along its frame. But that evening, one corner stood open. I stopped outside beneath it, my shoes sinking into gray slush. Inside, Sylvia entered the lounge carrying champagne. Brent followed with 4 glasses, and Miles came behind him with his coat removed, as comfortable as if he had been invited to a family dinner. My stomach clenched when he accepted a glass. Sylvia told him the buyers still expected closing on Friday. Miles asked whether my challenge could delay it. "Not once they see she has left," Sylvia said. Brent raised his glass toward the ceiling. He said the new suite alone proved they should have removed me years earlier, then laughed so hard champagne touched his knuckles. Miles gave a smaller laugh, the apologetic kind he used when he wanted acceptance without appearing cruel. Sylvia looked toward the lobby, apparently checking that I had not returned. From where she stood, my car was gone, my apartment was rentable, and my husband was holding her champagne. I remained outside the service window, breath trapped behind my teeth, while Sylvia lifted the bottle and declared, "She's finally gone." Brent laughed with her. Miles raised his glass, and the cork exploded against the ceiling. At 9:05 on Monday morning, March 9th, I crossed the Harbor Pine Inn's front drive as June Bell stopped beside the steps with a certified envelope in her gloved hand. She had delivered our signature-required mail for 11 years and always announced the time before asking for a name. 9:05, she said, brushing wet snow from her navy sleeve. "I need an owner's signature." Through the lounge windows, Sylvia and Brent were finishing coffee beneath the dent the champagne cork had left in the ceiling. I signed as a 40% owner, and June passed me the envelope. The return address belonged to the State Licensing Division. Sylvia came out of the lounge before I had broken the seal. Brent followed her, still laughing, until he saw the state crest. I carried the letter to the reception desk and read it standing beneath the empty keyboard. The agency had suspended the inn's pending license transfer and referred the ownership consent filing for investigation. One sentence had been boxed in red. Sylvia's sworn consent was dated February 29th, 2026. That day had never existed. My fingertips went cold against the paper. The filing had also represented that all owners approved the transaction before that impossible date. "It's a typo," Sylvia said. She spoke as if correcting a room charge. A date field cannot alter the underlying figures. Brent leaned over my shoulder, smelled faintly of last night's champagne, and asked whether the agency had included a number we could call. Miles entered from the corridor carrying 2 mugs. He stopped when he saw me, then filled the silence with the gentle explanation he had probably prepared for Sylvia. He said everyone needed to remain calm because an administrative error could be amended. I turned the second page toward him. The referral instructed the owners to preserve emails, access records, security footage, drafts, and text messages concerning the consent. Miles set both mugs on the desk too quickly. Coffee washed over the saucers and reached his thumb, but he did not pull away. His eyes moved to my evidence bag, where the brass master key rested behind clear plastic. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. He covered it with his palm, and I watched sweat gather along his hairline. I called Grant Webb using the direct number from our earlier conversation. He answered from his Boston office, and I put him on speaker while Sylvia, Brent, and Miles moved fully into the lobby. Grant had already received the agency notice. In his clipped voice, he cited Section 12.4 of the purchase agreement, which allowed the buyer to terminate if any ownership representation was fraudulent or materially unreliable. The suspended license transfer meant there could be no Friday closing. Sylvia gripped the reception desk hard enough to whiten her knuckles. How could one date erase a $3,200,000 sale, she asked. Grant replied that the date had not erased it. The false unanimous consent had. The impossible date merely made the defect impossible to ignore. Brent's face changed before anyone spoke again. He pulled out his phone and demanded to know whether the offer could be reinstated after a corrected filing. Grant said the buyer would not acquire a property while ownership fraud was under referral. Then what is the offer worth today? Brent asked. Grant paused only long enough to make the answer hurt. 0. Brent lowered himself onto the lobby bench, his laugh gone. Sylvia insisted she alone had selected the date and that no one else had understood the form. The letter contradicted her. Her submission account had uploaded supporting messages. Miles unlocked his phone, glanced at the screen, and whispered that investigators might read private conversations. His soft explanations had finally encountered people who preserved records. Grant stated that the buyer was terminating the transaction effective immediately and would send written confirmation. Sylvia told him the filing was clerical, not fraudulent. I placed both palms beside the agency letter, keeping them steady despite the hard pulse in my wrists. My consent was forged, I said. I will not call that clerical. Grant confirmed that his company would cooperate with the referral, then ended the call from Boston. June's postal truck rolled away beyond the glass doors. In the lobby, Sylvia stared at the date she had invented. Brent stared at an offer now worth nothing, and Miles stared at the messages he could no longer explain away. I left the certified letter open on the reception desk, where every one of them could see what had collapsed the sale. Approximately 6 months passed in court filings, interviews, temporary orders, and sleepless mornings at the rental cottage, where I remained while other people decided what could still be separated from the wreckage. At 7:30 on Tuesday morning, August 25th, I sat at the small desk by the cottage window and opened the final folder. Fog had erased the opposite shore, and the refrigerator clicked behind me with the ordinary persistence of a machine that expected another day. The divorce decree lay on top. Miles had cooperated with investigators, surrendered his messages, and admitted that Sylvia had promised him $75,000 after closing to rescue him from debts left by his abandoned cafe lease. His cooperation reduced uncertainty. It did not restore our marriage. Sylvia had pleaded guilty under an agreement covering the false filing and forged consent. The plea papers reduced months of deception to numbered paragraphs, but her signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Brent's borrowing had surfaced too. The expected sale proceeds had supported promises he could not meet. The court appointed a receiver after the owners could no longer operate together, and the Harbor Pine Inn was sold through a supervised process rather than Sylvia's private deal. The receiver recognized my 40% ownership before distributing the proceeds and paying valid obligations, including the $480,000 bridge loan Sylvia and Brent had secured against the property. My share survived. The place itself did not remain mine. The hardest document was not the decree or the plea. It was the receiver's inventory of the manager's apartment. 1 bed, 1 dresser, harbor view, no personal occupancy. My grandfather's map had been returned, rolled inside brown paper. I could afford another home, but money could not reproduce the sound of winter wind moving around those old windows or the exact blue that entered the lobby before sunrise. I had protected my ownership and still lost the rooms where I had learned every floorboard. Justice arrived with legal fees, a dissolved marriage, and a sale sign driven into frozen ground. At the bottom of the folder lay the locksmith's tracing report. I opened my evidence bag and removed the Harbor Pine Inn's "The Key" by its plastic tag. The code stamped near the bow matched the locksmith's record for the duplicate Sylvia had ordered. That trace connected her to the missing key, the nighttime entry, and the records used to manufacture my consent. It helped defeat the claim that I had simply changed my mind after signing. I held the key over my palm. Brass had worn smooth where my thumb used to rest, and for one foolish second, my hand remembered the weight of an entire building. Last week, I noticed that I had stopped checking the cottage lock twice before bed. The missing habit felt more accurate than any court order. Fear had finally ceased managing the door. If you have had to rebuild after trust was used against you, stay for the stories that follow and tell yours in the comments. I slipped the traced key into the top drawer of my desk, pushed the folder over it, and turned the small lock until it clicked. My coat weighted across the chair, and my new job began that morning. I stood with one hand on the drawer and listened once, not for footsteps, not for a stolen key, only for the quiet inside the cottage. Then I picked up my coat, leaving the locked drawer behind me and the door unchecked. Outside, the fog had begun to lift. I drove inland to the county preservation office, where I had accepted a position helping owners document old buildings before neglect, debt, or ambition erased their histories. My grandfather's map would not hang there. It belonged to me now, not to a business or a family argument. By noon, I was standing inside an abandoned schoolhouse with a clipboard, measuring windows while sunlight crossed the scarred floor. No one questioned my right to be there. No one had copied my key. When I signed the inspection log, my hand did not shake. In October, the Harbor Pine reopened under new owners. They kept the name and restored the blue lobby walls. I visited once, paid for coffee, and left before sunset. The building looked smaller without my fear inside it. Miles sent a final apology through his attorney. I read it, filed it with the decree, and did not answer. Some truths deserve acknowledgement. They do not require reunion. That winter, I framed my grandfather's map above the cottage desk. The brass key remained locked away, not as a promise that I might return, but as proof that I had survived being shut out. For years, I believed home was the place whose doors I could open. I know better now. Home is the life no one else holds the key to.